Welcome everybody. We are so delighted to have Chris Benda here to give us first a wildflower walk through Riverside and look at some trees as well. And then he'll also give us a lecture at 3 p.m. I'm Kathy Maloney. I'm with the Olmsted Society, and in honor of our 150th anniversary of the creation of the general plan, the Olmsted Society is hosting walks like this, so we hope you'll take a look at our website. This will be video recorded for everybody, and we very much welcome Chris, who is the Illinois Botanist. Chris walks all over the state of Illinois and thereabouts, giving lectures and giving tours. And so I'll just turn it over to Chris.
Okay, thank you. I'm delighted to be here to talk about my favorite topics, plants. So, we're standing here with a basswood tree, and like I just showed you, mentioned on the elm, also asymmetrical leaf base. Sometimes people think that this could be confused with like redbud perhaps, and that redbud has a symmetrical, so if you fold it over it's 2 equal halves. This one is not. But you know, when you're looking at trees, a giant clue is if it's in fruit, and we see this one is. And not only are they small, little round fruits there, but it has this bract. A bract is a leafy tissue associated with the flower, the inflorescence. So this is actually a bract, and it is with these little berries. So this is very distinct. There's nothing else that produces anything like this. So basswood would be the name, which is Tilia americana. And the basswood actually has really fibrous bark. So it was often used for rope. Really, you know, pull it apart and stitch together. And kind of the funny thing also about this is this tree often has stump sprouts. If you cut the tree or if it's dying, it'll send up all these suckers from the roots and it'll be dense around there. So I heard that Floyd Swink, who was a big jokester, a big punster, he would lead groups and he'd say, okay, I'm going to show you how to identify a basswood tree. Everybody gather around in a circle around the basswood tree, and everybody would do that, and he'd go, all right, you can identify a basswood by all the suckers gathered at the base. The edge of the leaf, it pokes through and it has these little fine bristles. So that's how you can tell that something's in the red oak group versus the white oak group. We have 21 species of oak in Illinois. And you can split them in half, basically, if you figure out if it's red or white. So white is very rounded and they don't have those bristle tips.
Is it pin oak or red oak?
Pin oak is a red oak, okay. Yes, exactly. And the pin oaks are very deeply dissected, almost all the way to the midvein. You see, these are pretty shallow. And they have these little tufts of hairs in the leaf axil underneath. So that's one way to tell the red oak. Have you ever heard the Know Your Oak song?
No.
You know May Watts was the famous naturalist from the Morton Arboretum, so she developed this. It's after the row your boat thing, so it's know your oaks, know them how they grow. Red oak, white oak, pin oak, bur oak, acorns down below. Sometimes I go like bur oak like this because they have these big low branches that spread to the ground, but I do like shivering thing for the bur oak. So very common red oak, Quercus rubra, which is also, you know, Latin names are often very helpful to understand the plant, and in this case it's a literal translation. The common name, Quercus is Latin for oak, rubra is Latin for red, so red oak, I call it the perfect common name. Sometimes common names can be a little misleading, and this one is very clear about what it is. Here, this is a Chinquapin oak, which is in the white oak group. There are no bristle tips. It's toothed, but there's really doesn't extend past the margin of the leaf. Of course, a white oak would be deeply lobed. These aren't lobed at all, they're just toothed, and they're kind of pointed toothed. So that leads us to Chinquapin oak, in the white oak group. And this was actually an oak that was prized by the natives because it has a large acorn and it has the least amount of tannins compared to other acorns. So you don't want to consume that. So what they would do is they would soak them and they would leach the tannins out, and then you grind it into flour or however you want to use it. So these made large acorns with very little tannin. So squirrels wanted them for that reason, but also natives would use them for this purpose. So that might relate to the name Chinquapin, perhaps. But it is a good oak species for Illinois, Quercus muhlenbergii, named after Muhlenberg for this one.
I mean, you're talking about extinct animals. Didn't the passenger pigeon associate with acorns and transporting of acorns? And now that that's gone, does that affect the propagation of oaks?
You know, I don't know. I don't know about the. I mean, I believe you, but I'm not sure about the passenger pigeons. But you know, the main thing that's affecting oaks is that our forests generally would burn regularly, and they would keep them very open. And oaks aren't shade tolerant, so they'll be in the understory as a puny little sapling, and they'll just wait for years and years until they get an opening, and then they'll grow up into that light. Well, by not having wildfire, where the tree canopy gets completely closed, and not only does that not allow sunlight in, but it also makes it more moist, traps in all the moisture, and it favors species that we call mesophytic species, or moisture-loving, shade-tolerant trees like sugar maple and ironwood and American beech. So those are all coming in the understory with our oak hickory woodlands, and oak regeneration is limited because of the conditions aren't quite right. So wildfire would not only keep kill a lot of the woody trees and keep it open so that sunlight can reach the forest floor, but also it would allow for wind to move through, and the wind would dry all that out, and it wouldn't allow for sugar maple and these other moisture-loving species to come in. So a lot of the times it's, we have these great oak forests and big oak trees. There's no regeneration going on. So that's one thing that wildfire is trying to, prescribed fire. We don't want it to be wild anymore, but a prescribed fire so that we can control it and bring that back into the scene. But this is they call it the carrot family, the Apiaceae, which some are edible and some are poisonous. This is the family that includes poison hemlock and water hemlock, and that's why I was coming to check to see what it was. But this is safe, but people have died mixing up Queen Anne's lace and poison hemlock. And here's the thing about the hemlocks. Our native one is water hemlock, Cicuta maculata. If you eat even a little bit of that, you will die, and it's a terrible, wretched, horrible death where you will convulse and seize and be in pain. If you eat the poison hemlock, on the other hand, which is non-native but very invasive, frankly, in our landscape, that is what Socrates died from, and that is a pleasant death. He drank the thing, he fell asleep, and you die. So make sure if you're going to get those, you get the poison hemlock and not the water hemlock. So, but both of those grow pretty commonly in our landscape, and we don't really worry about it. You don't hear, "Oh my gosh, poison hemlock is free and loose; it could kill you." But we hear about giant hogweed all the time, and all this hysteria about it, and it's going to cause this burning rash. We have native plants that will cause a burning rash. We don't talk about those. We have plants that are all over the place that can kill you. You eat a little bit. We don't, and maybe it's good, because otherwise we'd be out spraying and trying to control all these things, and we just instead ignore it. So sometimes I like to point out the media doesn't always highlight the right things, for sure. And we're trying to, though, combat this plant blindness by showing people that plants aren't things to just be afraid of, that they're to be appreciated. There's wonderful diversity and lots of interesting facts about them, and not to mention that we literally owe our survival to their existence, and so do all the other animals.
Can I ask you a question? What is this invasive thing that we see everywhere?
This here?
Yeah. What is that?
This is ironwood.
Ironwood?
Ostraya virginiana.
Okay.
And it's native. It's common though. But I wouldn't worry about it.
Oh, you would leave it?
Yeah, I'd just leave it. I mean,
it's not like
if you
buckthorn?
don't want it, you move it, but you don't need to worry about it. No, it's not like
it's not
like
buckthorny.
No.
Okay.
What is it?
Ironwood.
Oh, ironwood.
It's just a cool big
Very
thing.
dense bark is the name.
You call it ironwood, right?
I like it.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure of the animals that consume that. Yeah.
Is Queen Anne's lace native, you said? Queen Anne's lace is native?
No, it's not native.
But I don't think it's poisonous, because we have it in our hay, and the animals just kind of pick it out. But,
Ironwood tree.
One of the things
not
that
like milkweed.
is characteristic of the carrot family is where the leaf attaches to the stem, it has a little sheath. You see how it expands and wraps around the stem there? Think of celery, the base of celery. That's what that looks like. And celery is in the carrot family. So often when you see that sort of expanded and sheathing lower part of the leaf, you can think, oh, maybe carrot family. Also, these flowers, this inflorescence is called an umbel. It looks just like an umbrella, where you have one center point and then you have all these radiating, they're called pedicels here, the stalk of the flower is the pedicel. So this family was once called the umbellifers, referring to this umbel inflorescence, but now we call it Apiaceae, or the carrot family. So, but the umbellifers, so you know where it came from, that seems like a better name. A lot of carrot stuff too can cause a rash.
You know, that's something to know picking wildflowers for a bouquet. Because I have a property line and I just go out there and pick and cut and put them in my vase with the other lilies. I mean, you could like get the sap on you and it could be bad.
I was leading a tour a couple years ago and I was showing the poison hemlock and I had broken some off and I had it in my hand and somebody said,
yeah,
couldn't you get some of the oils on your hand and then, you know, die from it? And I thought, probably not, but I said, you know, I should wash my hands. You know? I didn't think about it at all until later in the day. I was eating a bag of chips and I went to lick my fingers and I went, I should wash my hands. Obviously I'm fine. Well, that might be, you know, the eye of the beholder, but I think I'm fine.
Yeah. I kind of never thought of that, really.
Chris, with the queen and lace, should we leave it if we have it like in the garden? You know how it pops off?
I mean, it doesn't matter. It's up to you. It's fine to leave it. It's
not invasive.
Fine. Yeah, it's not going to take over.
Thank you so much. And that wild, what is it they have in Wisconsin? Is it wild parsnip? Or
we have that here too, but yeah, wild parsnip
one that
is
if
yellow.
You get it and
yeah.
then the sun hits you, you have bad rash. Is that
Yes.
also from the carrot family? Or
Yes, it's the wild parsnip's the carrot family. We have it here. It grows on the roadside, and yeah, only if it's sunny. It's called phytotoxic. It's only with the light does it react and cause a rash. I wear sleeves all the time in the field. I feel like things that aren't poisonous often cause me to itch, so I take care. But I don't react to poison ivy, so that's good. You know, I literally couldn't do my job in some cases if I was very reactive to it. So we're making our way this way. Should mention here, we keep walking by these elms. You know, we have elms are super common. They're in every county, but they don't get big because the Dutch elm disease takes them out. So that's a problem. You know, the Elm Street was the classic name for the beautiful elms, and all those elms are dying, and they're trying to replace them or create hybrids and things. So this is a red elm. The leaves are like sandpaper. You can even hear it when I rub on it. One of the things about elms that make them fairly easy, this isn't the only thing that has this, but it narrows it down the options. The leaf base is asymmetrical. So when you fold it over, you see clearly they're not two equal halves. And so that's one thing that strongly suggests elm or elm family. The other funny thing is that this is called red elm or slippery elm. And another common elm is American elm. So slippery elm leaves are rougher than the American elm. And it actually, the slippery name has nothing to do with the leaves. It refers to the bark. It has a mucilaginous bark. So natives would peel it off and get into the inside and then chew on it, and it would cause you to salivate and help for sore throats and things. So the mucilaginous bark is where the slippery name comes from, because the leaves are actually rougher than on the American elm. And we don't have a very good piece of bark, but on American elm, if you take a piece of bark and break it off and break it in half, it alternates light tan, dark tan, light tan, dark tan. You can see that striped bark. So you remember that because the stars and stripes of the American flag, the American elm has the striped bark. The red elm, it's all consistently like a cinnamon color, every layer. So they're easy to tell apart just by looking at the bark. Poison ivy is the most ubiquitous plant in Illinois. It'll grow in the water, it'll grow on dry glades, it'll grow as a shrub, as an herb, as a vine, as lots of different ways. So it's very common. Toxicodendron, which means toxic tree, and then radicans is the next part, which means creeping or sprawling across the habitat. Like I said, luckily I don't react to poison ivy, but I still don't purposefully touch it.
Yeah, that whole vine.
Yep, all this bushy stuff here. And I've had it fool me looking at trees and think, I'm trying to identify the leaves, and I'm like, What's going on? Oh, it's surrounded in poison ivy. You gotta
so
look
when does
past
it get
that.
red? I always thought you had to look for a red stem, and I don't see that.
Yeah.
It's in the fall time.
Only in the fall,
Yeah,
not
when it changes color.
I should mention, we also have in Illinois poison sumac, which is very rare and only grows in bogs. So Bolo Bog is a good place where there's a lot of poison sumac, or Wisconsin has a bunch, but in Illinois, unless you're in a wetland, you're not encountering poison sumac. And then poison oak also is not in Illinois, so luckily it's a western thing. So it's mostly poison ivy is the one we have to fear. And it's kind of unfortunate that it's that way because we don't have many things that can do harm to you, but we have enough that it makes people reluctant to want to touch and smell, particularly plants. Plants have a whole world of fragrances, but we don't want to be handling things if we don't know what they are, and it could cause a rash, and it's kind of unfortunate. So part of these walks is trying to teach people plants and realize the ones that are safe, and because you can get so much from holding a leaf and feeling it in your hand. If you ask a botanist, what is that plant? The first thing they're going to do is touch it. And a lot of times people are, even with the classes that I teach with my students, they all stand 10 feet back. I'm like, come up here and look at the plant. So really touch and smell are wonderful characteristics to incorporate. Yes, so now we have a thistle. This is one of our non-native thistles, but it's not a real aggressive invasive kind. This is the bull thistle, Circean vulgare. They're very pretty and pollinators love them. Actually, goldfinches, they love the seeds. So a lot of times people keep thistles for the goldfinches. Oh, there's a monarch on there too. But they are kind of prickly. That's why they say, what they say about thistles. This'll get ya. They're very prickly. But we have two rare thistles in Illinois, the Hills thistle and Pitcher's thistle. And the Pitcher's thistle is actually a federally endangered plant. And it grows on the dunes, like Montrose Beach has some, and Illinois Beach, places like that. But these other thistles are more common and widespread. It is in the Aster family, but they have all disc flowers. You see a little bee working hard there on that one. Pretty prickly. This one, yeah. The stem is winged. See, it has this winged tissue up and down. That's an easy way to identify the bull thistle versus some of the other ones, like our native thistles.
What's the one, did you say, that's really invasive that everybody hates? Canadian or something?
I think they actually call that bull nodding thistle. Carduus nutans is the one that's along roads and it's tall, and the head is larger and it nods over somewhat. Canada thistle, we have two, which is also pretty aggressive. And that's the thing I should mention also, the problem with common names, they're very misleading and incorrect. Canada thistle is from Europe, and Kentucky bluegrass is from Europe, and butterfly milkweed is not really a weed, and anything that's named rush is hardly ever a rush, usually sedges. We have very few rushes in Illinois, mostly sedges, and obviously lots of grasses too.
So what's a rush and what's a sedge?
Yes,
Clue me
thank
in,
you
'cause
for
I have no
asking.
idea. You can say it, but it means nothing to me, so.
Sedges have edges,
Okay.
rushes are round, grasses have joints when the cops aren't around. That's what I had learned. So
Okay.
sedges have edges, meaning they're triangular because their leaves are tristicus, which means three ranks. So a leaf will come out this way, the next one will be 120 degrees this way, and the next one 120 degrees this way. So it gives it that triangular feel when you hold it. Grasses and rushes are both round, but grasses are hollow inside, and they have joints or nodes on the stem. They're swollen areas, so that's where the rhyme refers to. But the rushes are solid pith. But they're so skinny that sometimes that when you break it in half, it's kind of hard to see that. But bamboo is a woody grass. Of course, bamboo is hollow inside, so you think of that as a grass, showing you it's hollow. The PG version is grasses have knees that bend to the ground. But sometimes the more colorful it is, the more likely you are to remember. And I should also mention that that's not technically true. What I mentioned about the characteristics, but you can't really always, it doesn't hold true across the board.
Right.
It has to do with the flowers. Each flower on a sedge has one bract underneath it. And on grasses there are 2 bracts, and on rushes there are 6. So it's a little intricacy of the flower types, how they're arranged. because they're actually not even all that closely related, even though they look very similar. You know, we have 193 species of carex in Illinois, which is the main group of sedges, so there's huge diversity. But the average person would say, what's that grass? It's not a grass. So, more to learn and educate, of course.
This is a little bit of an experimental planting. It was planted 2 years ago, and the impetus for planting this is the increasing frequency of flood events that we have. So many of us remember when this is used to just be plain grass lawn, and however, because of all the flooding that happens as late as June, it could happen in August, it was impossible to actually bring the equipment down to mow it. So we brought in a landscape consultant to help determine what plants could survive both flood and drought, because we cycle now between that a lot. And in the first year of planting, now that it's in the second year of planting, we've identified those plants that are really doing well. Some of them did not do well, so we're replacing those now with the ones that the site is telling us this seems to be what's working here. So Chris will be able to tell us what plant is what.
Yeah, let's go just to the edge of the lawn. And
Yeah, I think it was.
call it Asclepias incarnata, or swamp milkweed. And it has these pink flowers, of course milky sap, that's where milkweed gets the name, which the milky sap is toxic. So only the monarchs have the ability to, digest the leaves and eat them, which makes the monarch poisonous. And they have these compounds that build up in their body. But all sorts of butterflies and other insects like milkweed. There's actually a little skipper in this one here. So this one likes to grow in the ditches and things where it's a little bit moisture, and it's a fairly easy one to grow and put in the landscape. Milkweeds produce a little pod that's called a follicle. It's a type of fruit, and it's they split open. Of course, they have the cottony seeds that are dispersed in the wind, and most milkweeds are like that. We have one that's called white swamp milkweed. Actually only grows down south, and it has a winged seed because it grows in floodplains where it's not very windy. So instead, the seed is adapted to float on the surface of the water and be spread that way. So what they're doing here is really smart, because you look at the lawn, or the thistle that we just walked across basically, and not only are lawns providing no wildlife value, they are heavy to maintain and often just incorrect for the location. So this here we have a variety of wetland plants that are adapted to this kind of situation, and we have a good variety of native wetland plants that are supposed to be here, and this is habitat. We need habitat for our plants, for our animals, and for places to things to survive. So I really like to see the conversion from lawn to open space, and where we allow native plants and various plants to thrive, and of course all the interactions that go along with that. This is in the Aster family, which are the composites, and something that is distinct to the composite family are these flower heads. This is called an involucre. It's basically this part below where the flowers are. And often you measure that to tell species apart, or you can see that there are little scales that are on the involucre. We call those involucral bracts, or more specifically, filaries. And filaries are specific to composites. So often you look at the filaries and they may be oppressed, they may be rounded at the tip, they might be pointed, they might be reflexed or recurved away. So there's all these characteristics just by looking at the involucre, or the little flower head, for various composite family plants.
Which ironweed is this one?
This is the, so they're all in the genus Vernonia, and this is Vernonia gigantea. Slight amount of pubescence, oppressed filaries, but they all have these nice deep purple flowers on them. We have native Eupatorium here. This is called late bone set. Eupatorium serotinum. It's kind of weedy, but it is native, and it is also in the Aster family. They're just in bud, they're not quite open yet. And of course here, the ever common ragweed. Common ragweed, which is native, but it is truly a weed of disturbed places. And this is the plant that causes the allergies, not goldenrod, which also blooms at the same time. Oh, look at these little adorable plants right here. This is a native wetland plant. Here's the flower, the cute little flower head. This is called frog fruit or fog fruit. You kind of see both names sometimes. Phylla lanceolata, a native wetland plant hanging on here at the edge of the lawn. You can see the leaves here, like on this one. There we go. There's the full plant.
Is weed a real botanical designation, or is that?
I use the term weed ecologically, and I'll expand on this if you attend the presentation. But you will notice that some plants are very pervasive on the landscape. They grow on lawns and roadsides and old fields and disturbed places. And then some plants are only found in intact, pristine, undisturbed areas. So a weed is the common, it's low on the conservatism scale. A conservative plant is one that only grows in an intact, never been disturbed natural area, versus a weed, more pervasive, common in degraded environments. So like a lawn and things, sidewalk cracks. So this is kind of weedy in that respect. But when it comes to your lawn and your garden and things, a weed is whatever you call a weed, whatever you don't want. They say the unwanted plant, right, is a weed. So, but I use it ecologically. But they are native. So a couple other things here. We continue this way. The asters are not quite coming into bloom. Back here and bring it up front. Unfortunately, I don't have a rush for the ultimate comparison. Like I said, rushes, there's not a lot of rushes in Illinois. There's a lot of sedges and a lot of grasses. But here's an example. This is a sedge. It's round.
Wait, a sedge is
Yep.
round?
So that characteristic doesn't always hold true, but here, pass this around. This is a sedge. It's very triangular.
Right. So a round
But this
sedge?
is also a sedge that is not triangular.
Oh, that's
That's
not
why you got to
fair.
look at the floral characteristics that I mentioned, which are sometimes kind of hard to see. But they call this bulrush.
Oh.
And it's a sedge. And it's round when it should be triangular. There's all kinds of confusion going on here. But this is in the genus Chinquapin. I have a long name here, but it's very soft too, very easily compressed. So I'll pass
Is that a
that
good
around.
one?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yep.
Now what's that one called? I've been yanking it out of my garden.
That is a native weed too. Yeah, it's called nut sedge.
Not sedge, okay.
Yep. It's a cyperus, and it has a very triangular stem. Not only is it triangular, but see the leaves are coming out in different directions. Look at this one. This is a grass, and grasses are disticus, meaning two-ranked. So they tend, in general, to have leaves that go one way and 180 degrees the other way, and it's just one plane.
Oh.
Okay? And this is also round, and although it doesn't look all that hollow in this one, they're supposed to be hollow. But this is called, what do they call this? Barnyard grass, maybe? Echinocloa cruscale. You know you're a botanist when you can't remember common names, but you remember botanical names like no problem. So a few different things here in the lawn. I wish these, here, we talk about this sedge. See, this is a really common and kind of easy one to identify because it has very lime green leaves, and then if we look at them, I can pull these up just right. It has that tristicus nature, where the leaves are three-ranked. They come out in 120 degree angles. Okay, this one here is Carex tribuloides. And of the sedges, the sedge family has a bunch of groups like the Chinquapin and the cyperus we just looked at. But Carex is what most people are referred to when they think of sedges. It's where all the diversity is. They're really hard to identify sometimes. You have to look at, these little seeds are called perigynia. Perigynia is a papery sac that it wraps around the seed, or the achene. And you have to look at the shape and the size and all these different characteristics to figure out. But this is a common one, so I can tell just looking at it, it's Carex tribuloides. And often you use your hand as a little pedestal, little table, and if they're ripe, ready, you can just crush them all in there. Then you want to look at them up close, see characteristics. Now when you use a hand lens, you want to hold it to your eye and bring the object up to your eye instead of doing like this. And if you wear a hat like I always do, it'll block all your light. So you gotta move, you gotta turn your hat sideways so you can have your light and you can look there. Oh yes, I can see the shape, I can see that they're winged, I can see a beak. You know, I see all sorts of features there just looking at them under magnification. There are 193 species that are often very similar in appearance, but this one also has that very distinct triangular shape feel to it. I call it the trials and tribuloides of sedge ID, Carex tribuloides.
So the sedges and the grasses don't have prominent flowers, but they are still good for wildlife and pollinators too?
Yes,
In
yes.
what way? Can you answer that?
Well, ecologically speaking, sedges are a dominant group of plants in every single plant community type that we have in Illinois. They're just overlooked. So it's a staple component of the community. So it's holding the soil together. But as far, they're all wind pollinated. That's why they don't have showy flowers. So they're not interacting with insects in that way. But one of the interesting ways they do interact with insects is ants. Some of these sedges are lower to the ground. Like these, they're off, the fruit are up high. But sometimes they're low, or what they do is they flop over to the side. And some of them are eaten by ants. The ants will carry them away and eat them. And then the seed is too hard for the ant, so they, will toss it aside, and that's how they're dispersed. It's called myrmecockery. It's a very fancy way of saying ant dispersed. So it's really kind of neat to see them when that happens. Myrmecockery. I also want to mention, even though they're not in flower, we have a lot of these asters. Oh, this is on an aster. This one is in flower. This is a willow herb, is the name. Epilobium is the genus, which is also a good wetland plant. It totally belongs in this particular habitat. But this here is an aster. And asters, they look like daisies. They have composite flowers with ray and disc. This particular one, if you look at the mid-vein underneath to see if it's hair or not, it's not. So this is Aster lanceolatus. Of course, people smarter than me decided that asters are now old world, and anything in the new world is symbiotricum. And I'm not opposed to changing names. It's furthering science and our understanding of things. But why do they have to take a nice, short, easy to say and spell name and replace it with a long, complicated one? Symbiotricum, it flows off the tongue. And they've done that with a number of things. Or, in my opinion, they've taken very lovely names and given them not so lovely names. And the perfect example is Cacalia. Beautiful name. It's now called Arnoglossum. Or Cassia was another beautiful one. Cassia, now it's Cana Christa. That one's not so bad.
Makes
but
the final decision on what it's known as.
Well, anybody who works on it can write up a manuscript, and then it gets published, peer-reviewed, and if it's reviewed favorably, then they publish, and then that's the word. But that doesn't mean you have to follow what they say. Some do and some don't. There's no right one name or anything. It has to do with different taxonomists will go with different names sometimes.
I thought there was that international classification of something.
There are some guidelines, but there's no hard fast, because people always want to know, where can I go to get the current name for something? It doesn't exist. You'd have to go through the literature, and even then, it's not always widely agreed upon. Just because somebody publishes something and says, this is what I think it is, and other people agree, doesn't mean that everyone agrees. And they might say, no, I don't agree with your science. You have your evidence, and I think it's faulty or whatever. But enough people agreed to get it published, and that's how we advance. So some neat things were here. That one, that's the common ragweed again.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Oh, and this is something we haven't seen. This is another Carex. You can see how similar. We were just looking at one over there. It looks very similar. But with this one, you take the leaves around it. The leaves are longer than the seed head. This is called fox sedge. So you remember that because you think of the fox hiding in the grass. The leaves are longer than the inflorescence. Carex vulpinoidea. Of course, vulpina, or vulpina, that means fox. That's the genus for foxes. So this is a fairly easy one. It likes wetlands, and this is great. I mean, here we have these native sedges that, instead of lawn, you have native stuff right where they should be growing. We have bidens behind here. This is our burr marigolds, or the beggar's ticks they call them. They have a forked seed that goes like this, and they like stick in your clothes like crazy. If you walk through them, you'll wish you hadn't. But they're native, they're composites, they have big showy yellow flowers, so there's nothing to worry about with the bidens, or burr marigolds. And of course, smartweeds. These are also, some are native and some are not, but there's a lot of these little flowering smartweeds that are wetland plants and good waterfowl food and things.
What did you call this one? Willow plant?
Willow herb, it's
Willow
called.
herb.
Yeah, willow herb. Epilobium. It's wetlands.
My
This
dog's
is stick
fur.
seed, yes.
Yeah.
And they're not quite super ripe right now, or they would really stick.
Oh, they do a little
So, when they're not quite ripe and they stick to you, and you see them, you can often just pull the whole thing off in one, and you're like, oh, phew, dodged it that time, right? But when they're really ripe, oh, they stick, and you can't brush them off. If you try, you just work them in more. You have to pick each one off individually. So there are lots of different seeds that stick to your clothes, and this one I think is the worst to remove. I've had socks I've just thrown away. You can't get them removed. But it is a native plant. This is actually closely related to Virginia bluebells.
Really?
Yes, they're in the same family, the borage family. You have these little white flowers on the end of them. But yes,
what is
stick
it called
seed.
again?
Stick seed. Hekelia virginiana is the name. So yes, I see a lot of that. I try to walk around it when I can, but sometimes you walk through it and at the right time of year you wish you hadn't. Here's a good aster. This is different than the one we looked over there. It's much broader leaves. In the aster group, there's like 39 species, I think, in Illinois. It's also very challenging, but half of them have a cordate or heart-shaped leaf base with a winged petiole or stalk. So that's a characteristic. And then you want to know if it has a serrated margin or if it's hairy. This is hairy and serrate. So this would be Drummond's aster, which is now Symphyotricum Drummondii. Used to be Aster Drummondii. I always joke and say I didn't know what it was, so I asked her, and she said, "Aster Drummondii, dummy." Or they say how to faster master the aster disaster, how they split everything out and change. Not everything became Symphyotricum. Some went into Eurybia, some became Dolingeria, others, there's another name I can't call off the top of my head, but most of them are Symphyotricum now. But aster was so cute and short and easy to say and pronounce. It's the aster disaster. And a lot of these are pretty common grasses you may have seen around too. These are actually a really good grass to plant early because they're native and they'll take hold and they'll prevent weeds from coming in, the non-native weeds, but they will be outcompeted if you have, more beneficial perennial plants. But this is a wild rye. And wild rye are in the genus Elymus. I always joke and refer to the Big Lebowski and say, "You're out of your Elymus, Donnie." But this one's easy to ID because the inflorescence here, it's inside the top sheath. The flower is like poking out of the sheath. All the other ones will be sticking way up on a stalk and not enclosed in the sheath. So this is Elymus virginicus, Virginia wild rye. And pass it around and look at these little cream-colored parts. Those are the stamens. Okay, and the stamen. So this is in full glorious bloom right now. It's blooming its heart out. Grasses have flowers, they're just very inconspicuous. But sometimes, especially through the lens, it's absolutely beautiful, intricate flowers. The female stigmas are very feathery and purple sometimes. Super cool Planticus Benda EI, that's the one that I named. So, so pervasive on the landscape, should point out invasive species. This is buckthorn, or common buckthorn. See the thorn, the pseudo thorn right here, this little pricker at the top. That's where it gets the name. It's Rhamnus cathartica, and the common buckthorn has teeth on the edge of the leaves. The glossy buckthorn has a smooth margin, and then they're much glossier like the name implies. But they're both invasive, and they have very edible berries that the birds will eat and move around. So that's why they're hard to, anywhere you have trees that the birds will perch on, then you'll get buckthorn coming in. But it's fairly easy to treat. I mean, unfortunately you have to use a little herbicide, which is glyphosate, which is essentially Roundup, people don't like to use, but you use a little bit of dab on it. You cut the stem and dab it, and then it won't come back. So it's fairly easy to control in that sense. And I've seen places that were total buckthorn and just black dirt soil, nothing underneath. And all the buckthorn's gone now, and there's rich wildflowers come back. And some of it they've seeded in for sure. It didn't all come back on its own.
I think they told us it was illegal to plant in Illinois, right?
The buckthorn?
Yeah.
Probably, yeah. Or certainly legal to buy.
Yeah. We're trying to get rid of it.
Yeah, it's good. There's a lot of it for sure.
How much of the buckthorn root do you have to tear out to make sure the plant won't come back?
Most of it. Yeah, I mean that's really labor intensive.
Yeah, it is. I've done it in my yard.
Cutting the stump and then treating just the leftovers is the best. You can also spray, the leaves, but now you're using more herbicide and it's dripping off, and you could spray something you didn't intend to. So it's best to, clip them and then dab a little bit. Same with bush honeysuckle. But I mean, it's fairly easy to control versus some other herbaceous plants or annuals that you have to spray or hand pull. So it's one that, it doesn't grow overnight, so it's easy to stay on top of it once you get it removed. But again, this is that plant blindness where we've all just sort of like turned, our blind eye to it and then let these forest preserves grow up in these invasive shrubs. But we're really on top of it a lot of places now over, after a decade or so of neglect in some cases. So I'll tear these off so we can actually see. But here is the long feathery bud for pawpaw. Now pawpaw is the only species in this family in Illinois. Everything else in the family is tropical. It's a tropical family. It's the custard apple family. So this is what we call a naked bud because it doesn't have any bud scales on it. Bud scales exist to protect the bud in the wintertime. The bud is tender tissue. The scales are hard, and so they protect the bud in the winter. Well, if you're a tropical family, you don't need bud scales. There's no winter. So this is about as far north as this gets in North America. And so it has this naked bud that makes it easy to ID. And they say that John James Audubon, as he traveled across Illinois, would make his little bird paintings with these as paintbrushes. You take off a little pawpaw twig and you use it, and it looks like it's perfectly adaptable to that use. So it's easy to ID in that respect. Also, these produce big maroon flowers, and their maroon flowers are usually smell like rotting flesh, at least to insects they do. I've never gotten much of scent out of pawpaw, but like skunk cabbage, that's the whole thing that's going on there. They're attracting flies and beetles that feed on carrion, so they look maroon like rotting flesh, they smell like rotting flesh to bring in those pollinators, and pawpaw is one of those. So often they say, sort of the old folklore was, pawpaw is only going to produce fruit if you put a dead animal at the base. The idea being that dead animal will bring in the carrion feeders and they'll pollinate. But pawpaws are clonal. So all these are genetically identical and they can't self-fertilize. So they often are limited in setting fruit, especially if you plant them in your yard, because the pollinator has to be traveling among various pawpaw patches to actually bring in new genetic material for them to set seed or to fruit. And of course it makes this big fruit that is like banana-like in texture, and they're becoming more popular and easier to find in farmers markets and things, so I've heard them being called hipster bananas in the trade, but they are very delicious. And you want to make sure that you don't pick them off the tree. You have to let them fall. They're not ripe unless they fall. Of course, once they fall, they're going to start to rot on the ground, and every other animal wants to get it. So what you do is you go up to one that has fruit you think they might be ripe, and you shake it. And whoever falls, you collect those up right away. So you make sure you get some delicious pawpaw fruit.
We have a grove of pawpaw, they won't pollinate each other. That's what you said, right? Because that's
Right. Yeah, we gotta have many around. But it has nice big, in southern Illinois, this is very common in the woods, and it gives it a very jungle-like feel. And that, is sort of appropriate in that it's a tropical family. Anaceae. Okay. Yes. Yes, this distinct bark on this tree is a hackberry. Hackberries. We were walking by a few. They have very, very corky bark, very warty bark to them. But it is a native tree. We have a hackberry butterfly that associates with this.
Is that the same right there?
That is the same, yeah.
And what are those growths on the branch that's going across the path?
Huh. Gosh, that's a good question. I'm not sure I've ever seen that before. Interesting. I don't know.
What do you think of the village prune leaves and those are stuff?
Well, it does look like some of them have been cut and they're looking like that, but that seems like weird. Why would you cut those?
Right.
I don't know, huh? It's the tree of speculation. And this back here, oops, excuse me. This is pokeweed. Yeah, pokeweed. It's kind of similar foliage to the pawpaw. These are actually in fruit, but they will turn purple, and they'll stain your hands purple. They would use it as a dye and things.
The critters eat the berries?
Yeah. Now, this plant is poisonous, but they talk about poke salad, right? You've heard of that? You can take the fresh, like when they emerge from ground, you can take the stems and saute them, and they can eat them. And that's what, settlers would do at one time. But yeah, all parts of the plant are poisonous, but it is a pretty common native plant that we have in Illinois. I let it grow in my yard, but if you have kids or something, you might want to be aware of it, or just leave it alone, and it's fine, but it is a native plant. It has very weird flowers. In fact, it's in flower and fruit here. They're kind of already going to seed a little bit, so some of them up here are open with the stamens on them, and then going to make a green seed, and then eventually it'll turn into a fleshy purple berry, dark purple. And white vervain is Verbena urticifolia, and urticifolia means with foliage like an urtica, and urtica is stinging nettle. So it's saying it has foliage like stinging nettle, which it kindly does, and it is hairy, but it doesn't have any stingers, it doesn't have any trichomes, so it's fine to touch.
It's elderberry?
And this is elderberry. Yes, great. Love elderberry. I call elderberry the Paul Simon plant. And it's the singer, not the legislator. And because it's groovy. 59th Street Bridge. Slow down, you move too fast. Feeling groovy. It has a grooved rachis. You can see that there on the stem of the leaf. It's the groovy plant. Of course, my students now are like, one of my students this year, he said, like Simon and Garfunkel? And I said, well, Paul Simon was the whole band. I mean, let's be honest.
What did you call that one again?
This one here?
Yeah.
White vervain.
White vervain.
Yep.
When elderberry, when these berries become purple or black and they're ripe, you just kind of shake it like that with a bucket underneath, and the ripe ones will just fall off. Oh. It's impossible to pick. So you can harvest berries from this just quickly, like fill up half a bucket in minutes.
I was gifted some elderberry wine once, but I can't say I cared much for it. And I'm the kind of guy that likes all wine.
It's good for brewing beer.
Brewing beer, okay, right on. Yeah, down where I live, we have this brewery called Scratch Brewing Company, and they use all sorts of things in their yard and their farm for their brewing, and they have these really different beers and things. But yeah, Sambucus canadensis is the elderberry. And interesting too about elderberry is it has opposite leaves. Wherever there's a leaf on one side, there's another one on the other side. They're paired, and it's a woody plant. So there are very few woody plants in Illinois that have opposite leaves. So you can remember what they are by remembering buck-made scat. And buck is for buckeye, and MADE is maple ash dogwood euonymus, and then S is for Staphylia, which is bladdernut. And anyway, the elderberry fits in there because it's in the addox ace, so the A in the scat covers the elderberry. But basically there's like, a dozen things with opposite leaves. And so you think buck-made scat to remember all of them, like the elderberry. Okay.
And which was the primrose again? The evening primrose?
Right here.
Okay.
These yellow flowers. We have a rare Enothera perennis that grows in the prairie here. We call it prairie sundrops. And it is a formerly endangered plant as well. This is another sedge here. It's got little tiny, not much for flower parts, but you know, I was showing you one back there. It was hard to see, they were so flat, but the Periginia you can see better here. It's this papery sac that encloses the seed is inside. And it's distinct to the Carex genus. So a Carex is a Carex because it has the presence of Periginia. And often ones like these, they're large and they're inflated. So they're easier to see, and you can, you know, rip apart that and get that little achene, the seed that's inside. This is Carex grayi or Gray's sedge. It has these downward pointing. It usually has more of like a, looks like a mace kind of. It's like a spiky round inflorescence. Most of them have fallen off, but you can see the downward pointing ones. And that's a key for that. And it's very triangular. There's another ragweed. This is the tall ragweed. They call it Ambrosia trifida. And what's interesting is that it can have regular unlobed leaves, or it can have very lobed leaves, like a, hence trifida, split into 3 lobes. So it can have 2 types of leaves. Now, interesting. Look at this. Same thing or different? It's different. It looks very similar, but these leaves are rough and hairy, and these leaves are smooth. Plus, it's going to have little inconspicuous wind-pollinated flowers that are being produced here. And this one's got, this is a composite flower. So they are related that they're in the same family. This is tall ragweed, and this one here is called golden glow, or green-headed coneflower. It's Rudbeckia laciniata. It has lacineate or cut divided leaves. And Rudbeckia is named after Dr. Rudbeck, who was Linnaeus' mentor. So Linnaeus named this genus to honor his teacher, Dr. Rudbeck. That's kind of a cool association. This is Joe Pye weed. Joe Pye weed has whorled leaves. So you see there's 5 leaves here that attach to the stem at one place. So I always tell my students, when you see a plant with whorled leaves, you go, yes! Because there's very few plants with whorled leaves. It narrows it down big time. But this one, it's kind of interesting. There are 3 species, and you need to count the number of disc flowers per head. So these have very few. I see there like maybe 5 or 6. But you know, often you can look at a plant and know what it is. You go through the technical manual, and it asks you to count this and look at that feature, and it's really complicated. So they say that dichotomous keys or these technical manuals are written by people who don't need them for people who can't understand them. Because they're very complicated sometimes. But technically, yeah, you want to look at the number of little flowers. The composites have ray and disc flowers. So like a daisy, the disc flowers in the middle and the ray, the petals we would look at, they're actually ray flowers. But sometimes they have only ray or only disc or both. And this one only has disc flowers. All these little flowers in here are just the disc flowers. The Joe Pye weed. And the 2 woodland species have a very rounded appearance to the inflorescence, and the wetland one is very flat topped, so that's in the key also to identify them.
Do they generally always get that big?
Yeah, they get pretty tall. Yep, and they were used medicinally. Joe Pye was apparently a medicine man. That's where they get the name of Joe Pye weed. But it is definitely a very prolific plant, and it must be having a good year this year. I've seen it all over the place. Now, this tree is a common tree too. Poison ivy tree. Kind of, sorta. Sometimes people think this looks like poison ivy. It does have leaves of 3. It does have that little thumb like poison ivy will do, but this is a tree and it's opposite leaved. Okay? Only the poison ivy is going to be alternate, so these are all opposite. Plus, this is box elder. And box elder has a very green glaucous stem. That whitish hue that rubs off when you touch it, that's called glaucous. You think of a grape. Grapes have that glaucous coating to them. Or glaucoma is like when you have a clouded vision. So it's that whitish coating on things. It's just another clue, another term we use to describe plants. Glaucous. But box elder is a maple. It's in the maple genus, Aster. It's Aster negundo. But also it can have leaves of 3 or sometimes more. This one has 7 leaflets. So it's kind of a trickster in that way. Fool you. Box elder. Oh, look at this down here. We got a ground cherry. It's a little flower and fruit. So little Chinese lanterns that hang down. Not quite seed in there, it's too small, but there's the cute little flowers. So they're often kind of hard to see because they are hanging down underneath the plant. But ground cherries in the genus Physalis. This is Physalis heterophila. So you can buy these at the store, right? They have a little papery outside and you peel them off and get the ground cherry inside, they're edible.
So is that native?
It is native, yep. There's a bunch of different species, but this is a common one. They're cute little lanterns that hang off that. This little one down there. Join your buddy there. Let's go look at these yellow flowers. These are sunflowers. A little bit here. There are lots of different types of sunflowers. This is Helianthus divaricatus, woodland sunflower. Helianthus literally translates to sunflower. Heli is sun, anthus is flower. Again, the filaries, the involucre underneath, that's a very big clue. This one has lots of filaries and they're long and pointed. We have a similar flower that's called false sunflower. And it has very few filaries that are very rounded. They don't look long and pointy like this at all, but if you look at the top, it looks the same. It has even kind of similar leaves. But the thing is that with woodland sunflowers, the Helianthus genus, only the disc flowers in the middle are fertile. These ray flowers are sterile. So if you look at this, you might think this is one flower. This is a lot of flowers. There's probably 50 disc flowers there, and each one of these rays is a separate flower. It has all, well, except for this particular instance, but normally ray flowers have all the parts necessary to make a seed. What I'm getting at is sunflowers have sterile ray flowers. They only produce seeds in the middle from the disc flowers. These are all sterile. So when you pluck a ray, the whole thing comes out, all the way to the base. If you go to false sunflower has fertile ray flowers, so they produce seeds. And if you go to try and take a ray flower off, it'll tear, because it's holding it at the base because it's going to make a seed. It's just more robust and more well connected. So you play the she loves me not to identify the false sunflower from the sunflower, the real sunflower.
Which sunflower is this one?
Woodland sunflower. Okay. It's very scabrous, rough leaves. They're alternate. I think it likes to grow clumpy like this.
The false, that begins with the S. What is it?
False
sunflower? Or I'm getting mixed up with something.
The false is Heliopsis helianthoides.
I'm thinking of something else.
Which is a fun name because it's basically saying the helianthoides. Oides means like this or similar to. So helianthoides means like a sunflower, like a helianthus, which makes sense. Okay, so that's the sunflower there. See, now these leaves are rough but not as rough. This might be the American elm. Let me see if I can get a piece of bark to show you what I was talking about earlier. So it's not the best example I've ever had, but you can still see that there's very light portions to the bark and then very dark cinnamon colored portions. So it's striped. So you think of the stars and stripes of the American flag. Somebody could hand you this little piece of bark and you could go, oh yeah, American elm. And they'll go, wow.
It's the stars and stripe one?
Yep, it's got the layered bark. You see the light tan color and the dark tan color there. So Ulmus americana is the American elm. Striped bark.
And the other one was the slippery elm, right?
Yeah.
That is the rougher leaves?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And then down south we have a winged elm.
Can you get the picture?
Yeah. And winged elm has winged branches on it. They make it very distinct. Got elderberry again. Oh, this is the real deal Solomon seal.
Real deal?
The real deal, and you can tell because look at where the berries are. The flowers are produced along the stem under the leaves on the real deal Solomon seal. On the false Solomon seal, the flowers or berries are all terminal, at the end of the plant. Now some people say to call something false is kind of insulting. They don't like the name false, so they call it Solomon's plume because it has the plume of little white flowers at the end of it. This is Polygonatum biflorum. It has, and even without the flowers you can tell because if you look at the veins here, they're all pretty equally conspicuous and there's lots of them. On the false Solomon seal there's 3 main deeply impressed veins with lots of inconspicuous veins in between. Plus this is very rubbery and thin and there's that glaucousness again, that whitish coating. So just with this leaf you can separate the real deal Solomon seal from the false.
Are they both native?
They're both native, yep. Formerly in the lily family, and they've hacked apart the lily family now into lots of families, so it's reclassified. And this is a very common orchard grass. It's non-native, Dactylus glomerata. It's not invasive, but it's it's weedy kind of. It grows a lot. But you're curious what these things are. They're dried up and finished. This is the George Washington tree. Not chop down that cherry tree. This is black cherry, Prunus serotina. I was looking for this yesterday because I was teaching the class and I was trying to show them that cherries have a petiolar gland. So the stalk of the leaf is the petiole and there's a little bump on it right there. And that's the gland. And again, some of these inconspicuous characters are what you need to look for to easily separate various species. So cherries have that little gland on the petiole. Also, when I first started learning black cherry, for some reason it fooled me a lot, and I found the go-to thing was scratch and sniff. It's kind of like the pawpaw. It's fragrant. I wouldn't say I like the smell, but it's distinct. So if I would always question, I would scratch a little bit of the bark, smell, and be like, oh yeah, that's wild cherry. Wild black cherry. Of course, the plums are related to cherries too, in the same genus. Of course, there's other unpleasant smells in this area.
I was just going to say, it smells like something died.
Oh yeah. Here's a little native flowering plant. We call this daisy fleabane, Erigeron annuus. So it is an annual. It has ray and disc flowers. And if you look in the key, one of the separations to figure these out is he says, are there less than 100 ray flowers or 100 and 150 ray flowers? And I'd say that's a very long game of she loves me not, counting all the ray flowers on there. But this one actually, Daisy fleabane. Fleabane, yep. It has spreading hairs on the stem. That's an easy way to identify the daisy fleabane.
Now when a plant has the name bane in its name, does that mean it repels the animal that it's talking about?
Supposedly.
Okay.
Or it's bad, like we have dog bane, and that was because you don't want your dogs to eat it.
Okay.
There's baneberry is another plant. You don't want to eat those berries.
Right.
So yeah, it is saying that. Beware.
Does it keep fleas away?
I think it does.
Supposedly. I don't know. That's a good question. We have another milkweed here. It actually has milkweed beetles on it that are defoliating. This is our common milkweed. And it's common, like the name implies. The funny thing about common milkweed, Linnaeus named it, and he named it Asclepias syriaca, as in from Syria. It's from North America. It's a North American plant. I don't know. He must have got it mixed up in his pile of Syrian plants. I don't know how that worked. But this is actually a scientific name that's a misnomer, because it's not from Syria. It's North American common milkweed. And the common milkweed is the only milkweed that will make a pod that has all these little bumps and protrusions on them. All the other, this is called a follicle, the type of fruit. All the other milkweed follicles are smooth. They don't have these bumps on them. So you can identify it just with those little the features on the follicle. The fruit pod there. And I also see here, hard to grab, but I'll just pull the whole thing out here. This is native also. This is called greenbrier or catbrier. It has a very prickly personality. You see how dense these bristles are at the base? That identifies this as Smilax tamnoides or Smilax hispida, which we call bristly catbrier. So they're often not liked because they're so prickly, but it is a native plant, it's a native vine, so it has its place here in the landscape. But often they're very, they'll reach out and get you.
So it seems like this bush over here is covered in that.
Yes.
Is that what it does?
Yes, that is what it does, and that's often why it is sort of unfavorable. And you're like, you can't walk through it. You wouldn't want this in your lawn or your landscaping.
So that's okay to leave that like that.
Yeah, this is doing what it's supposed to do.
Even though there might be dead bodies.
Well, is that what we're smelling?
Yeah.
This is called white snake root, also very common and native. But this is the plant that killed Abraham Lincoln's mother. It causes milk sickness, so cows will avoid eating this unless that's all that's left. And in the time of the pioneers, the woods were grazed hard. So the cows would congest this plant and then it would make their milk toxic. And if you drink the milk, you could die. And it took them a while to figure out, this. And so people had died, including Abraham Lincoln's mother, by consuming milk from cows that had eaten this plant. But it is another composite. It has only disc flowers, no ray flowers. Hedgertina altissima is the name, which is kind of funny because issima or issamum means the most. So altissima is saying the tallest. It's not a very tall plant though. This is about full size. So maybe compared to other Ageriatinas, it's kind of tall. But
This was the greenbrier? This one doesn't have any thorns on it.
Bristly green. Oh, okay.
That was the one that's all over the bush over there.
Well, there are several species. Well, the thorns are only going to be at the base of the stem where it goes into the ground.
Okay.
But it could also be rotundifolia, which is a similar plant. But that one should have big, thick prickles on it. So probably still tamnoides. So I hope you enjoyed the tour of the wildflowers and other plants of this area. And I think we saw a nice variety of different things, different families, upland and wetland things. And so it's really nice to see that native plants are given a place here in Riverside along the Des Plaines River to grow and thrive and really provide good habitat for lots of critters. So I really commend the city of Riverside for their efforts on this landscaping, and I had a fun walk. I hope you did too. Now we'll continue into the library and have a presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.